So if the first half of this story is about workers feeling squeezed by forces they can't control, higher prices, falling real wages, growing inequality, and fears about the future, the next question becomes, what does all that mean for the American dream itself? Because for generations, the promise was straightforward. Work hard, support your family, buy a home, raise your children, and gradually build a more secure life than the one you started with. Today, that promise looks very different. A new report from the Pew Research Center shows just how dramatically family economics have changed over the last several decades. In 1970, the dominant American household model was a single breadwinner, usually a father working full-time while a mother focused primarily on caregiving responsibilities. Today, that arrangement has become the exception rather than the rule. Most households now depend on two incomes simply to maintain financial stability. Dual-earner families have become the norm, while single-income households have steadily declined. In many cases, both parents are working because they want additional luxury spending. They're working because one income no longer provides the economic security it once did. That shift tells us something important about the economy we've been discussing. When politicians and economists point to rising household income statistics, those numbers often reflect more hours worked by more family members rather than dramatically improved living standards. Many households have compensated for stagnant wages by adding a second paycheck rather than by earning substantially more from the first one. In other words, families didn't necessarily become wealthier. They became more dependent on work. And that creates new vulnerabilities. When housing costs rise, when healthcare costs rise, when childcare expenses explode, or when one worker loses a job, there's often less margin for error than previous generations had. The result is that economic growth can coexist with growing insecurity. That's where a recent USA Today report on the American dream becomes particularly revealing. Survey data cited in the article suggests that Americans haven't abandoned the dream altogether, but they have redefined it. For much of the 20th century, the American dream was closely associated with upward mobility, homeownership, and accumulated wealth. Increasingly, however, Americans describe the dream in more modest terms: financial stability, freedom from debt, the ability to pay bills without constant anxiety, having enough time for family, being able to retire someday. Think about that shift for a moment. The dream hasn't gotten bigger, it's gotten smaller. A generation ago, people dreamed about prosperity. Today, they dream about stability. And that may be the most important economic indicator of all. Because when millions of people begin redefining success downward, not because their aspirations changed, but because their expectations changed, that tells us something profound about the economic environment they're living in. It suggests that insecurity has become normalized. Viewed alongside everything we discussed, the rising prices, the shrinking purchasing power of wages, the growth of discount store shopping among six-figure earners, the explosion of online communities dedicated to financial survival, and the concentration of wealth at the very top, a pattern begins to emerge. The American dream isn't disappearing, it's being renegotiated. Workers are adapting to an economy that increasingly asks more of them while offering less certainty in return. Families are working more hours, relying on more earners, carrying more financial risk, and redefining success around goals that previous generations often took for granted. The question facing the country isn't whether Americans still believe in the dream. The question is whether our economic institutions are still capable of delivering it. Because if the benchmark for success shifts from prosperity to merely getting by, then the challenge isn't a crisis of expectations, it's a crisis of opportunity. And until working people see greater security, stronger bargaining power, and a fair share of the wealth they help create, that crisis is likely to continue, regardless of what the stock market says.